So I may do some Metamodern yoga here in a little bit here. I'll start off talking. I'll start off talking about something. How about so I've recently said that if Bruce Lee had survived, metamodernism might be like 20 years ahead of schedule. I really think he was on to some of the ideas way ahead of schedule because of his unique suite of talents. But I think we got there anyway in some sense. We got there anyway in some sense. We got to where we're looking at the transition between postmodernism and metamodernism. I think, Eliezer Yudkowsky, the sort of AI super rationalist guy, Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist, and Donald Trump, in their own way, all contributed to sort of hitting the late postmodern era notes. Like, since Trump, people have talked about a post-truth era or society, and they blame Trump for what they see as the loss of trust that can be justifiably given to certain authoritative statements. This is a point Sam Harris goes on about with some care to point out how there used to be a certain kind of statement you could trust, and now you can't. Scott Siskind, the popular and brilliant blogger, made a similar case. And I think they're right, but I think the meaning of that is different when you look at it in the bigger context. To some degree, Trump is less trustworthy than the next person. And yes, gradations of trustworthiness matter. But Trump, to some degree, revealed the underlying untrustworthiness already present. He did it himself. And when we sort of locked onto his patterns, we noticed some of those patterns were rather similar to others. It turned out that we were a little bit behind. It's like culture had shifted before we knew it had. We didn't realize that we were vulnerable to a sort of Trump move where he could reveal the underlying untrustworthiness already in the system and sort of make us aware of what had already occurred, in some sense, subconsciously. I think part of the reason Trump was able to come in at the time that he did was because of Obama. Because under Obama, people really thought things were going to be different. And then when they weren't, they were disappointed. And then it was Hillary Clinton, and they were just like, it is just so obviously not going to change. And they went with Trump, which was change. And you could say it was a bad move because the next 4 years were worse and it was bad timing because of the pandemic and stuff. But you could say, look, big picture here. Big picture here is 4 years is 4 years, and revealing the underlying untrustworthiness of the system is an important thing to happen. You might as well hit it a little bit sooner if you can. So Trump is not entirely chaotic and not entirely negative. In the big picture, the very fact that someone like him could win reveals that we need some other form of change than him. And if we don't offer a better form of change, then people will go with the change they think they can get. And it looks very hard to change things. It looks very difficult even for a well-meaning president to change things. And maybe that's part of what people felt during and since Obama. It's like, you look at Trump and you're like, look, I could imagine him getting into office and facing who knows what kind of pressures and then doing things anyway. And he kind of did that. A lot of people getting into office and finding out how big the job is and what they're plugged into now and having to trust advisors and bureaucrats. I mean, to some degree, they must let themselves get swept along. The question is only how much. And if the answer is usually a lot and everything stays the same and there's nothing you can do about it, then the idea of Trump is partially just, I think he might be able to actually make his own choices in office. It's like the very thing that makes him more capable of making choices also relates to the quality of his choices being worse than it could be. But at least it's something. At least it's an actual human being at the top and not whatever shape those immense pressures force people into. Yeah, I think to some degree that's why at that level of politics, the highest level in some sense, Trump bullying people, you might say it makes him look worse than them. That's true in a lot of contexts. But when his opponents can't handle the bullying, it's like, well, is that even worse though? You might say morally no, and you might say pragmatically, if they're going to be the president though, it's very important that they can't be bullied, isn't it? So people watched Trump go out on people and make a fool of himself in some sense, but they also saw that they couldn't handle it, and many of them voted for Trump, which is not to say that Trump was actually a good candidate necessarily. He might have lost to Biden the first time. He might have lost to Bernie. He would have lost to Obama. He might have lost to Bush. He would have lost to Bill Clinton. He would have lost to Ronald Reagan. It's like, the point is, he got an unusually easy election because Hillary Clinton was not one of the more popular or persuasive or sort of robust candidates to put up against him. There's something else about how a lot of people don't understand that Trump is intuitive. They just literally don't understand, frankly, in the way they probably don't understand intuitive people in general. There's sort of this intuitive people versus nerds thing, where it's like really hard to explain intuition. You basically just can't explain it. Anything that can be explained stops being intuition, and then if it's inexplicable, it's still intuition. And in our culture, our heads of state are always these sort of polished, finishing school, Harvard, Ivy League types who know their way around a boardroom or something. And you go meet the heads of states of other cultures and countries around the planet, and some of them are more like classical politician types, these charismatic people who often have great social skills and warmth or persuasive ability and often operate to some degree intuitively, like Trump does and did in negotiations and then did in debates and in speeches and so forth. And then he governed that way, which was interesting. And he tweeted that way, which was interesting. But if you just literally don't understand intuition or intuitive people, then when one of them gets elected into office, you're going to be like, what is this crazy, unreliable nonsense? It's unclear, it's vague, it's often wrong, it's knowably wrong, it's like weirdly wrong. It's like, why would you even lie about that if you knew you couldn't get away with it? And they chalk it up to just utter stupidity. And it's like, okay, you need to allow yourself to be confused, though. Utter stupidity, really. Find somebody, find anyone utterly stupid and try and get them in elected president. I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So Trump spoke intuitively, and that meant violating the rules of careful, accurate speech very often. And so he racked up, like thousands and thousands of official lies. And, I'm sure he lied for real. I didn't track the news too much, but I'm sure he did. The question is, how different was it relative to normal politicians anyway? The normal politicians are more careful. They pretend they don't do it, and they try to cover up for doing it in a way that's like theoretically explains things, but like leaves you with a bad taste in your mouth. And it's like, yeah, it's cleaner in some ways, but Trump did something more dramatic that probably eroded trust more dramatically. But in the context of an office that perhaps was no longer worth trusting, was that was that good or bad? Is it good to erode trust in an institution that no longer deserves it? What if it's on its last legs and trust and faith in it is all that's holding it together? And then you smash the story, the narrative that's keeping this shambling thing up. And then what? And then everything just collapses. We disintegrate. We lose our integration, our ability to cooperate. See, we talk about the coordination problem, but it's already a solved problem and it's always an unsolved problem. We already coordinate something like better than ever before in history. That's probably literally true. Even when we talk about how we seem less coordinated and harmonious as individual societies in, for example, America, or I think the UK, for a whole host of reasons, multiculturalism and postmodernism and nihilism and loss of shared narratives. Even then, we've lost these shared narratives, and we feel less cohered together as a people when we look at the national level. But don't we feel more like one people when we look at the global level? Like that's the sort of obvious, predictable trade-off, isn't it? At some point, technology progresses, and one way or another, people are capable of going from point A to point B physically in space. Like transportation improves. And then, like, how it's only a matter of time before the natural borders that kept cultures mostly only touching at the periphery is going to go away. That's obvious in some sense, that's predictable. And then if individual areas are now less homogenous and are more of a mixing pot, like America has classically embraced, then there's pros and cons to that. But one of the common cons is loss of certain kinds of unity locally. But the obvious gain is gaining some kind of perspective beyond the locality, perspective beyond the borders. It's like it's lucky. Like there's a reason people like Europeans especially make fun of America and Americans for not being well traveled or cultured. But one, we only have two geographical neighbors, and one of them is culturally quite similar or has been classically, and the other is vastly different, like in a way that going from Germany to France isn't. So there's that. But the other thing is the whole American melting pot idea meant that America is extremely rich and active culturally. That all bits of Europe were always in there, and that was just classically. And now in the modern age, it's more and more and more multicultural, and now many nations are going into this place that America has been before. Many nations are now experiencing the same thing. And maybe they all need to embrace being melting pots. Some people have said that America went from being a real melting pot that cohered and brought things into a single whole, into a salad bowl, where the pieces are all in there, but they haven't been homogenized. They each have their own separate existence, separate but equal. And, the idea of going back to the melting pot would sound retrograde and regressive to say, oh wait, why do the Koreans who come here have to assimilate and melt into this common American ideal? Why can't they just be who they are while being in this spot? Like, what are borders anyway? And this sort of a thing. That's another reason the multiculturalism is sort of hitting harder. It's partially that we all live together more now, and it's partially that we're all online together more now, and it's partially that we don't believe in our own system in the same way anyway. Even if I'm sure some countries are still largely homogenous in terms of who's there, but even they're going through the online version of it. And maybe they're going through the philosophical or the cultural version of it, which is losing faith in their own system, even if there isn't any other system around. And as new people from all around the world come in, there will be sudden alternatives. And the weaknesses in your system and the things you take for granted, the things you can't justify, will suddenly come into salience. That's why the God debates are back on YouTube, because now that we're being more multicultural, the Christians are debating again, not with the atheists this time, but with the Muslims. And so now that there's this new cultural uh, touch, they're brushing shoulders, in a new way. It's like they're rehashing old debates, discovering new ones, and calling into attention like their vulnerabilities, things they can't justify, things they take for granted. Um, and so the sort of multicultural thing, maybe it's correct. Maybe it's correct that it would be retrograde to go properly back to the melting pot in America. Maybe you go from the melting pot, and that was amazingly progressive in its time for any country to welcome people like America did, even asking them to join it. Like, think, in some sense, like, think about how this sounds to a modernist. Like, appreciate it from their perspective. They're like, are you kidding me? Like, we were America. Like, we threw open the borders and welcomed everybody to walk up, ask to come in, and get in. And we made it our whole thing for like decades, you guys, like for real. And all we said was, come be one of us, come be American with us. And now it's this horrible, how dare you ask us to be American? Why should we melt? Why can't we be a salad bowl? And it's like, well, it was a beautiful thing in its time. And maybe it was because at the time that was genuinely progressive. And maybe it just needed to develop into the less conformity imposing version of the thing. Maybe. Although it's funny, it's funny to look back on propaganda like Superman versus the KKK. It's like you look back on these comic book heroes and you realize that they're very like obvious, transparent, unsophisticated propaganda. There's like one where the Joker beats up Hitler or something because he may be a criminal, but he's an American criminal. It's like, and Superman says, hey, he beats up the KKK and makes fun of them. And he tells the kids, remember, if anybody tells you not to accept someone as an American because of their race or their religion, tell them they're being un-American. And it was like, that was the thing, right? Anyway, the point I'm getting at is, who knows if we've gone from melting pot to salad bowl to whatever comes after that. I'm supposing there's some natural progression here that we're probably in the middle of in America, but which other countries are just now entering way back at the beginning. Maybe they're at the point where they need to embrace being melting pots. Like if you're a newly multicultural country in the way that America purposefully embraced decades ago, then maybe you need to do that in order to enjoy many of the things America got out of that unifying, harmonizing identity. There was a lot of opposition to it, but the story was there. and it made a big difference. You know, you could criticize it, but it was mostly Americans criticizing it because anybody else from the outside for a while, it was like a miracle. And now with its flaws, maybe worse, maybe just more apparent. Maybe the story was never quite so mm, what like it's a beautiful vignette, but that's not the whole story. You know, among other things, the civilizations that were supplanted in order to establish this one. But I don't know. I don't know. Every generation replaces the one before, you know? If you look at the civilization of America as every single American, go forward 100 years and they're all dead. It's all different people. It's what's hmm, hmm. Yeah, it's really slightly, it might seem like an irrelevant tangent, but Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote Hamilton, the musical, right? Won all the awards, really wonderful. It's so metamodern too, by the way. Really gorgeously done. And oh my goodness. One of the great things. And then he not only wrote it to stardom, but like super stardom. He's like the new music guy for Disney. I mean, Disney, right? Like Disney, which was a lot cooler a few years ago, but still pretty cool, especially when it comes to music, where, music matters. That's the good thing about music. Music has some beauty in it, even if it's impure, suppose. Like you can't ruin it completely. So its value is still there. And he made wonderful music. And in Hamilton, there's this great song. One of the repeating, I'm not going to say it's a theme of Hamilton in the play, it's a theme of Hamilton, the cultural artifact. One of the reasons I think Hamilton is interesting as a cultural artifact is over and over and over again, it connects the past political events and context to the modern one. And this is like, well, isn't this just standard like preacher with the Bible trying to make the kids like make the Bible come to life for them, make history come to life? Isn't that just straightforward 101 what you do? And it's like, maybe, but he did a really good job of it. And he does this great song in it where they talk about New York City as the greatest city in the world. Like this is even back before America was, what America became. Wasn't even its own nation yet. But the claim, which may or may not have been entirely true, I don't know. The claim was made, though, that New York City was the greatest city in the world, and that it was something like the cultural hotspot of the world in some sense. It was the spark that was igniting the world in revolution. It was the shot heard around the world, the American Revolution, and then the French Revolution, and America was this melting pot. It was this new land where anybody who was like, hey, new land, cool, I'll go there. Like, how common are those people? Maybe not that common. There's a few in every country, but they're in every country. And not everybody went there at first, but it was still quite a melting pot relative to, if you were Dutch, you were among the Dutch, or you were a visitor in a foreign land. The idea of assimilating, of sharing a home, these were unusual exceptions to the rule. And America was the cutting edge, and it was a great leap forward in the sense of cultural mixing. And not even that long in, New York City already the cultural cutting edge. And this song in Hamilton hits interestingly close to home because in the modern day, what's the cutting edge cultural hubs of the world? I mean, the Bay Area is a strong one. I believe New York City is still a strong one, actually. And then we look, of course, outside of America, and I imagine places like London and Paris are to some degree, but on the same level as the Bay Area. I mean, it's interesting that it's the Bay Area. It's not even one city anymore. It's like a few cities. Like that's a pretty cool for the cultural cutting edge to be like multiple conglomerate. That's cool. And then the other bit is online. Online is really the new cultural cutting edge in some sense. And it's no real substitute for what you can do in person with a local scene, which is unfortunate because it would be so nice to just have the cutting edge scene available to anybody who wanted to participate. But no, you have to live in a specific spot, and everybody wants to live in that spot, and it's crazy expensive. And this happens always because of the natural gathering and then the cost of living effects. But although it's inevitable to some degree, we can soften it with online cutting edge cultural spaces. If we lean into that, accepting that it's not going to be a complete substitute in advance, knowing that, yes, but making the best of it we can, then I think we can also aim it specifically at on ramping people to seeding local cutting edge cultural scenes, dialectics. Scenes are like reliable dialectic machines. And if there comes to be dozens or hundreds or thousands of people online who are all sort of the I wish I was participating locally in the cutting edge cultural space, but unfortunately I'm online. But actually that's not all bad because that's everybody, right? That's that pattern again. uh, you're all scattered, but then you all go to the one spot, right? That was America. It was a Schelling point in some sense. And that it is interesting to wonder to what degree people were self-aware of, mutually aware of the fact of, okay, look, yes, I'm going to America for XYZ reasons, but to what degree are they aware that, oh yes, and many other people are also going to America for those same reasons? We're sharing the same target. And I know that they exist and they know that I exist. This is the common knowledge thing again that allows for new dynamics of computation, coordination to arise. So this is another clue as to how you kick off coordinating effects is you share a common point of attention and a common perspective, and you have to know about each other. And so, we do this online. It's the faux cutting edge cultural scene that we can halfway throw together online as a substitute for the real one. And then people get to know each other online and coordinate to move in big enough chunks that you have a whole scene. Because look, some people are super connectors, and maybe they want to be in the Bay Area, and they might deal with hundreds of people. But frankly, most people, even who live in the Bay Area, I mean, how many people realistically are they? Do they need to be like on that cutting edge really culturally? And how many of the people can just be cool people? So, you coordinate in chunks online and then I'll move to some random live in Florida. I live in Florida. I've heard Florida's becoming a new Schelling point. I've heard it's gone from like New York to Bay Area, a little bit to now Texas and Florida. But yeah, the idea is find low cost of living places. And if like 50 people try to move to these places, I don't know, relatively, how hard is that really to do? 50 people to move in at the same time. Maybe this is very difficult. But I bet there are places, isolated places, a little bit unusual, right? It's all a bell curve. Like go to the bottom 10% and say, aren't there places around the country that have a surplus of housing? And the housing is very cheap, And there's a reason for it. And the reason is nobody wants it because nobody wants to live there. And the reason nobody wants to live there isn't because they don't have good food and electricity and warm houses and clean streets and safe neighborhoods uh, and that kind of thing. It's because there's no cultural scene. So you say, great, hand, well, key meet lock, puzzle piece meet complementary puzzle piece. Surplus housing, no cultural scene, a cultural scene that needs to live geographically near each other instead of scattered and only connected online. So that's an idea. I would do that. I don't know where to go or who to go with, but I'd love to just start like putting a list together and be like, dude, we should just be in like Trenton, Mississippi or something. It's like where you can live like a king for $2,000 a month. And I have sights on Idaho. I was born in Boise and I really quite like Boise actually. I believe it's exploded in a way that has made it much more expensive these days. But it wouldn't surprise me if you go out a little bit on the edge or some cities you may know about. I'm sure it's a great place actually. Yeah. And it's generally a quite safe place. Beautiful mountains. Maybe the altitude's high, so I don't know. What do we think about oxygen concentrations? Um, Altitude. But yeah, Idaho could work. Yeah, and I feel like is Idaho generally pretty safe in terms of like natural disasters and stuff? The Bay Area is like a little bit vulnerable. I live in Michigan in this place that just like nothing happens. Um, Idaho doesn't really have earthquakes, though, does it? It doesn't have volcanoes or tornadoes or hurricanes. So that's good. Yeah, so maybe Idaho. And it would be really cool if we could manage it, would be to have two places, one northish and one southish, 6 months in each based on the weather. Like Idaho in the winter, unfortunate. Puerto Rico, the infrastructure still isn't great. I don't know how hard that is to solve. But, Texas, Texas, or, Mexico, or Costa Rica, or Belize, or El Salvador is now extremely safe. Like, wow. Who wants to go be on the ground floor at Cultural Revolution Address El Salvador? I just saw an interview with the president. He says that the murder rate is now 2 per X amount or whatever. It's lower than America. It's lower than basically everywhere on Earth. It's like the lowest. They like got all the murderers, or all the murderers are keeping it down. It's crazy. I was a missionary in El Salvador for 2 years, and it had the highest homicide rate in the world, except for Iraq, technically, and that was only because it was the war. Uh, and I think it was the poorest of the Central American countries. Um, Lots of gangs. You just saw them all over the place. Um, hmm. Anyway, it's relatively safe to be there as a missionary because they sort of have a thing about people of God. But I was kind of thinking I wouldn't go back to visit, like, as a civilian. But now it's so safe, and it would be amazing to go see how the culture is it like coming to life? Like, what are they doing now that they're like wrapping their heads around that it's suddenly safe, and then they're suddenly free to do all these things. Do what things? What do they do with this? And I still there's a particular place that had the best pupusas I ever had. I'd like to go back there. And there's a wonderful family down there, and some friends. But that would be amazing to go from like Idaho to El Salvador, 6 months back and forth. There's a pretty good chance that Americans get an automatic 6-month tourist visa every year in El Salvador. I think they do in Mexico. It might only be 3 months in El Salvador. And the other thing is that there's good reason to think that it's not merely this one thing in El Salvador. The same president like made Bitcoin into legal tender, government accepted legal tender. Oh man, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if it's really safe now, I don't know. It's so interesting because as a missionary, I basically lived in poverty. Like, the monthly stipend was incredibly low, not because the church was incredibly stingy exactly, but because the cost of living was incredibly low. Yeah, I think I actually paid more into my mission though anyway. They use a system where the missionaries that go to El Salvador and the missionaries that go to Norway, pay the same amount. So there's a redistribution effect. And so everybody pays the same amount. So I paid way more in, come to think of it. But yeah, you can live in El Salvador for like a few $100s a month or something, which worked out just fine. And I always had extra money until there was this one place we were staying where one of the people we were sharing the dwelling with was stealing the money we left out. Took us a while to figure it out. It's interesting how, yeah, it was interesting. Anyway, do I just want to tell the story? Sure. Here's the story. So, about Dubai, is that what you said? Dubai? I know very little about Dubai except that I assume it's very expensive. Um, it's very hot, I suppose. So I don't know how the seasons work over there. Is it like relatively cool 6 months during the year? Is there a winter that it could be good to go during? Is it why Dubai? Why Dubai? Um, what do they got going on? Is it just beautiful? And beauty can be a real thing for sure. A billionaire playground. Sounds extremely expensive then. I mean, yeah, I really don't know much about it. Um, could be worth considering. But I basically lived in poverty in El Salvador, but I didn't think about it that way. I didn't feel like it was like that. I felt nothing. I didn't feel poor at all. I felt rich in the sense that I had come from a rich place. But you say, well, that's not what rich means. If you're living in poverty, are you going to say you're rich because you came over there from a rich place over there? But yeah, so what Americans would consider living in poverty, I don't know. I was there. I was there for 2 years. It was fine. Um, yeah. I mean, I'd have been worried if to live there my whole life. I'd have hoped the medical care was sufficiently sophisticated that it had the, best things. But I don't know, in terms of just day-to-day living and it being like extremely low cost and like, fairly run down in a lot of ways and quite close to the jungle in a lot of ways, sometimes where it would surprise you. And before, tons of crime, but now very little crime at all. Um, and of course, you can just pay, you know, again, you pay. Like we lived as basically ordinary people there for a few. I mean, I think there was one place we stayed that was less than $100 a month in rent. Might have been 60 a month or something. They used the US dollar there because their currency was out. Really, really tough. Really rough place and had been for such a long time. But I don't know. Yeah, but obviously, obviously you can also pay, 500, 1,000, 2,000 a month and get perfectly nice places that are there. But anyway, point is, what's the point? Point is cultural cutting edge. We have online tools to bring us together in a way that we haven't properly made use of, I would say, yet. And, we want to bring self awareness to that and start coordinating on purpose at small scales. That's the answer. The answer to how do we get this big thing that only works if we get a bunch of people to do it is you do it at small scale. And you say, how does that get us to the big scale? You say, it doesn't. You say, well, then we're not going to do it. It's like, right. That's the dilemma we've been in for so long. So we don't know how to do it. So we're just going to not do it. And so to jump out of that, it's sort of this leap of faith type thing where you want to coordinate at small scales. And you say, how is that going to show us the way? And you say, well, we'll try at small scales and we'll try poorly and badly. This is something Peterson emphasizes, right? Do a bad version because he knows how hard it is to do things at all. He, experienced that as a psychologist for people who really struggle to get their lives together. So a lot of his advice is emphasized around like, if you can just barely do anything, if you don't know how to make any headway at all, here's how you get yourself just to slowly start stumbling uphill in a stupid, but not completely stupid, slightly less stupid way, right? He has this very minimum bar sort of thing that appeals to the people at the bottom, right? At least the bottom in terms of the ones who need that kind of help trying at all. So, he's called the stupid person's smart person. And it's a sort of insult against him. It's like, yeah, only stupid people think he's smart. Anybody who's really smart can tell that he's not. And it's like, well, I guess that's what you get for talking to the people at the bottom, isn't it? Nobody does that. Name a public intellectual who goes out of their way to make themselves accessible and to speak purposefully to the people who are generally considered of cultural insignificance. Not whole groups segmented by, race or gender or something. Because in every group you have your high achievers and your low achievers. He's just like all the low achievers. If you're just trying to be slightly less stupid, if you're trying to start improving your life in any way at all, which is the best way to make sure at least you're always on a positive trajectory. Sometimes you'll be on a fast one and sometimes you'll be on a slow one, but at least you'll always be in a positive trajectory. And a lot of what he says that people criticize, and sometimes with correct and savvy criticisms, but a lot of that comes from a place of not understanding how to talk to people that most people never talk to. So if you understood that, you'd, like the way he talks about God, and people are like, why does he do this? Richard Dawkins is just like, this is just bullshit. And it's like, no, you don't understand is that there's a kind of person that Peterson can reach that Richard Dawkins can't. And in some ways, Richard Dawkins is too humble. I heard him make an argument once. He was like, somebody said that, we don't need to be a religion to be good. We're talking about it. We can tell it doesn't make any sense. But look, we're not around committing murders. So there goes that idea. But, probably we should keep it around anyway because other people might need it. Other less intelligent people will need it. And Richard Dawkins says, well, what a condescending thing to say. I mean, how condescending is that to say, oh, yes, we elites don't need the religion to tell us how to behave ourselves and not kill each other. But, oh, yes, those people down there need to be told lies. And it's like, yeah, that is a extremely socially unacceptable thing to say, Richard Dawkins. Good point. And it's very condescending. Who could dare to hold such a position when you've so precisely and elegantly, cleanly, and incisively articulated, embodied, and expressed everything that is wrong about it? But along with everything wrong about it, there might be something right about it. I mean, Richard Dawkins is an exceptionally intelligent person and who uses his intelligence in a highly sophisticated way. And on the one hand, he's wonderful pedagogically and so elegant, and he knows how to cross and make ideas that are supposed to be hard to explain. He can explain them and demonstrate them and give you he's targeted at efficacy, right? He doesn't just teach the idea. He's like, we need our culture to be better by people being more rational. And so it's not enough just to teach the idea. I have to get it to somehow hit so hard that people actually behave differently in their lives, analyze how they relate to things differently, maybe rethink their belief in God or whatever. And so, you see him teach like science lessons about Mount Improbable, such a wonderful explanation. Or when he expresses the power of coincidences by having the whole audience participate, say, half of you hope for a heads, half of you hope for a tails on a flipped coin. And then flip, and everybody who's wrong, sit down and flip and flip and flip and flip. And somebody in the audience it comes down to, and it's like, what just happened for you? And they said, I flipped the coin like 10 times in a row. And every single time it was exactly what it needed to be me. And then it's like, that must have seemed uncannily improbable, impossible, only explicable by some kind of higher force, coordination, synchronicities. And yet it's so clear from the pedagogical participation that we just did this. Literally, somebody always would have that experience if we ran this experiment. There was nothing going on besides random chance, completely random in this case. And in some sense, we're all subject to certain things like that all the time in life. And in some sense, we're occasionally the one who flips a coin 10 times in a row and is just dumbfounded that it's just like heads, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, 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 heads, tails. And it's like, how did I just do that? That's insane. And then you try and do it again and it just stops. And you're like, what just happened? What just happened? I called my shot 10 times in a row. And then I started again and nothing happened. And it's like, yep, it's not even that crazy, actually. About 1 out of 1,024 times, you can flip. So if 1,000 people try to do that, one of them's just going to do it. It would actually happen. It's not even that crazy of a thought experiment. So he's really wonderful in that sense. And in another sense, he doesn't know how to genuinely reach people. He's a lot smarter than most people. And he's a lot smarter than people who are below average. And I don't think he knows how to reach them at all. I think he would basically agree with that. And I think he would say that it has nothing to do with whether or not it's actually true or not. And he would be right about that. And meanwhile, he would be trying to influence culture and partially succeeding, but not in a way that looks like it's going to shift things in time for us to coordinate better as a species. And Peterson is doing it and having his own splash. And his splash even seems bigger in some ways. And it seems much more memetically aware. Although Richard Dawkins actually invented the term meme and analyzed it beautifully and elegantly, articulated it wonderfully in The Selfish Gene. Nonetheless, he is, in some sense, rigidly bound to the truth in a way that keeps him from being too mimetically effective. Anytime there's a question, he just speaks the truth over and over and over and over again. And And that can be a powerful strategy. And look how powerful it's been for him. And look what it's led him to. And he's done wonderful things and been a wonderful person. And it can't be the most mimetically effective strategy. It hasn't mimetically won out over other strategies. And generally, when you aim at two different targets, if you hit the truth target all the time, you're going to be missing the other target. And so Peterson compromises. Dawkins might say, "Oh, you mean he lies?" It's like, well, not exactly. And he's like, "Well, you mean he bullshits?" And it's like, that's a little bit closer. And also not exactly. He speaks intuitively, among other things, like Trump, which is another reason you can see how that makes sense. People say Trump is lying like all the time, like thousands of times and thousands and thousands. And it's like, sort of, some of the time just lying like politicians lie. Some of the time lying in this weird way that's more about intuitive speech. And Peterson is sometimes in that camp, except Trump has fully embraced saying absolutely anything to hit the target he's trying to hit. And Peterson is constraining himself to this truth, but a slightly less rigid relationship to the truth than simply saying what it is all the time, which is a little bit Richard Dawkins's version. And so instead of saying what it is all the time, Peterson tries to advance our discovery of and integration of the truth. And it's like, what is truer? An action which is an utterance, which can be interpreted as a sentence, pointing at a literally accurate fact about the universe or some piece of it? What's truer, that? Or an action which may or may not be an utterance, but which accelerates our discovery of new truth and insight and distribution of it to the group and integration of it to refresh ossified, out of date, inefficient, orderly structures and reorient the society to the pragmatic necessities of the time. And so, which is truer? Well, for some definitions of true, it's much truer just to say things that are interpreted as accurate facts. And that's what Richard Dawkins does, and the mimetic effect is wonderful, but not exactly not big enough to get the job done, let's say. And Peterson is trying to do something more savvy, and so he's trying to build a machine of dialectic processing and distribution. And he's been doing his podcast for years now, and he's been using it to reach out to different communities. He reaches out to thought leaders in various communities. He establishes a dialogue with them. He goes into each dialogue understanding the real meaning of dialogue and understanding the meaning of cooperation and allyship and friendship over time. He's very conscious of the overtime relationship when he goes into the first dialogue with someone. And he plays for long-term cooperative play, long-term serious cooperative play. And sometimes he has to make people get serious, and he's good at that because he lives seriously enough for it to hit when he asks somebody else to be serious in some sense. And when you hit him with something that's supposed to like overwhelm him, he can, come back with something even bigger and be like, yeah, the existential burdens of life are like a fatal disease, and Poison, I'm with you, man. So Peterson's been establishing these dialogues with people, and he plays them for long term, and he establishes relationships in some sense, not just with their thought leaders, but with the groups that those thought leaders represent. And so he reaches out to specific groups and he establishes a dialogue with them. And this is similar to how Trump establishes dialogues to do his intuitive things. See? So they're both intuitive players. And Trump, much more intuitively intuitive, I suspect. And Peterson is analytically intuitive. He spent his whole life studying intuition, the shadow, the reconciliation of the subconscious and the conscious. And the border between them is a little bit like intuition. Intuition is like the signals that your body can deliver to your experience that are not as well processed as others. They're not processed enough that you can articulate them. Your body has failed to transform the phenomena of photons and air molecules and chairs and so forth into signals that generated precise insights that you could consciously look at and analyze in your experience. It failed to that level, but it succeeded at processing enough to produce perhaps a dim awareness, a vague impulse, a feeling, sometimes even a clear feeling, but still a feeling. And so this is one of the reasons Peterson was ready to rise to fame the way he did, when he did, because he'd spent much of his career thinking about intuitive speech and the function it played in the dialectic and in refreshing societies and keeping them from going the way of the totalitarian horrors of the 20th century. And he was like, okay, intuitive speech is a big part of it. In totalitarian states, you can't have intuitive speech because the propaganda narrative is too vulnerable to it and has to be protected by taboo and so forth. And so he's like, great. So as long as intuitive speech is around, et cetera, et cetera. And he preached that, so to speak, as a professor, as a psychologist for decades. And it made like a little splash, and people were like, that's awesome. And then for decades, he lived with his life work being like a successful professor, and that was it. And then after decades of living, not knowing he was going to be famous, and still, and all along the way, he worked on having good relationships with family and friends, a wholesome life, a successful career, some degree of entrepreneurial and artistic and musical exploration and development, and understanding the necessity of developing a sense of humor and etc. and etc. And appreciating play and dreams and drama and literature and movies and stories and fairies and myths and all of this, etc., etc. And then the mimetic moment came, and everything he said about intuitive speech could suddenly be presented as about free speech. And everybody was like, these are the most amazing insights about the importance of political free speech I've ever heard. And he's like, and that's part of why he had so much to say on the subject that was so compelling. And it was only sort of about free speech. It is ish. Like it was originally applied to the trans pronouns. He was like, I won't necessarily. I have said people's requested pronouns. I don't know if he was ever known not to have used somebody's pronouns in a class or in his life, even. But he says he won't necessarily use them, and there shouldn't be a law. There shouldn't be a law, he said. And, so it was a hot button cultural issue, and everybody came to talk to him. And then instead of it being business as usual with some random person with a loud opinion that took 15 minutes of fame, he had all of this content, and he just kept coming back with more, and they kept trying to come at him, and he kept responding with these like deep insights, and they didn't know how to respond to them, and that's partially because they were very smart and true, and it's partially because they were more about intuitive speech than about political free speech, and so it was a little bit hard to tease apart what was confusing about that kind of thing. But anyway, it worked, and as he's reflected and pointed out, it was also because he had like 100 hours of his lectures and content up on YouTube when that moment arrived. He said, one, that he was protected because people could go see what he'd said for a long time and pick it apart if they wanted. And if it was supposedly full of like horrendous things, they could take a snapshot of it and show it and be like, see, look, there it is. But instead, people started making these little short YouTube videos of like why children are this and why men like that and why animals, and just all these sudden like odd topics but also interesting, and he consistently was interesting in them. And so he went from the political to the psychological, and he had his self-help book that he sold, and it was the bestseller and millions. And then he a little bit transitioned back into the political again, and that's where he's spoken a lot more, you might say, simplistically, without as much care to tease apart narrative from reality. I don't know. He's been more political, basically. He's been more political, and I don't know if that's good or bad. Richard Dawkins would say it's basically selling out in some sense. A lot of people will say, "Well, I liked psychological Peterson. I don't like political Peterson." But if you're trying, as he spent his entire career trying, he spent his whole career trying to avoid the hells of the 20th century. And he looks at the world as it is now, and he sees the hells of the 20th century coming back. And he's kind of right, but they're not going to be like the 20th century. They're going to be the 21st century ones. And to his great credit, I would say, to his great and perhaps even heroic credit, and he does talk about the heroic story, and he has used that to shape his own perception, how he looks at his whole life. And he was ready in some sense, when he first came onto the scene, like very early on. Here's why that's interesting, okay? So first he does something. He doesn't know what's going to happen. It's business as usual. Suddenly there's a big uproar, and they come to ask him, and he comes back onto public in some video that'll be kept online forever, and he's going to say something. And why is that important? It's because it's what he had to say when he didn't know anything that was going to happen. He didn't know what it was going to look like, and he came on the scene and he said that he thought the law shouldn't be that way. He thought it was wrong, and if they passed it, he wouldn't follow it. He would disobey it. And if they fined him, which was the stipulated punishment, he wouldn't pay the fine. And if he wouldn't pay the fine, what were they going to do about it? Imprison him? And if they were going to imprison him, he said he was going to go on a hunger strike. And that he wasn't going to do it. And that it shouldn't be a law. And picture that as what you should have done in the 20th century. Like, isn't that what you should have done in the 20th century? That's what he did. That's what he had prepared to do his whole life in some sense. And in the Gulag Archipelago, which he talks about a lot, He one of the very I only know one of the earliest stories, and I know only this because I only listened to an audiobook of the beginning of it. But one of the earliest observations that Solzhenitsyn makes is they came for him, they told him he was under arrest, he had to go to prison. They didn't even know how to get to the prison from his house because there was no GPS back then. And would he please guide them to the prison? And they'd work everything out there, and I'm sure it was a false charge or whatever. And so he led them through the public streets to the prison, and then that was his last chance. And he said, we didn't realize how often this was happening, how many dozens or hundreds of people were being led away like this and leading themselves away like this every week or month or whatever it was. And nobody realized going about their day in the street how many people were walking away to their doom all around them because he didn't say anything when it happened. Nobody said anything when it happened. And then it was too late. And so he said, we should have shouted out in the streets over and over again. We should have shouted out in the streets. And you might say, what could you shout in the streets? Imagine you're in every day and one person shouts out in the street and they're like beaten up or whatever and carried away. And a few people hear about it and some people gossip about it. And what? If it happens one time, nothing happens. And this is a coordination problem again, right? If everybody did it at once, this is like how the Spartacus slave revolt happens, is they're actually capable of revolting at any time. There's more of them than there are of the guards. But it's not until the right narrative moment makes revolt a salient choice and somebody makes that choice and some second person chooses to join in and then they all join in and then the enforcement mechanisms break down. So that's what Solzhenitsyn wished they'd done, in some sense, was coordinate and cry out as early on as was still soon enough to make a difference. And so that's what Peterson did when he was like, okay, look, here's the law. The law, okay, they did it. They did the thing. They did the thing. Here's the thing. It's happening again. Happened in the 20th century. Here's again. Here's a law that says you have to call people this word. It's like, okay, that's the slippery slope. That's the Trojan horse. That's the like, as soon as they say we're allowed to tell you to say things, you know, you've lost your intuitive speech, the refreshing thing in the society. The propaganda has become not just taboo, but a taboo enforced by law, and in this case, a fine. But if you don't pay the fine, then isn't it implicitly imprisonment? And if you resist imprisonment, isn't it implicitly violence? And if you fight back, isn't it implicitly to be killed? You know, this is a point the libertarians make, what they want to emphasize, that it's always at the point of a gun, which is a little simplistic as well. But Peterson was acting out what he thought would have been the solution in the 20th century, what Solzhenitsyn said would have been the solution, basically, in the 20th century, and what could have been the solution. But what would you need to cry out? The right message. What message? If you just said, no, they're taking me away, I've done nothing, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. Okay, would that do anything? You need a message that will somehow propagate and cause other people to cry out when it's their last chance. So with your last chance to make a mimetic splash, you want to deliver a message that reminds others to make a mimetic splash, that reminds them that if and only if enough of them coordinate to do this together, can they overwhelm the structure of the system here. The encroaching tyranny. And so what should you yell? And I don't know, maybe you should yell something like, when they take you away, cry out so we all know how bad it is and fight them in time. Right? That's like 2 sentences. You could probably shout that out before they started beating you up. and unless they beat you up extremely, effectively or whatever, or ruthlessly, you could probably keep shouting out that kind of thing for a while and just say, when they take you away, cry out so we know how bad it is, so we fight them before it's too late. And say this message, when they do it, so that we keep reminding each other to get together and notice and cry out and hear the warning signals and coordinate and stop it. Something like that. If you cried that out and then somebody else got led away who'd heard about it and then said, okay, well, yeah, if I get led away, I'm going to cry this out. Because it seems like, yeah, if enough of us cry it out, then enough of us might notice, then enough of us might coordinate, then enough of us might fight, and then we might turn this around. So yeah, if I get led away, I'm going to cry that out. And so it's useful to have that kind of thing prepared, maybe. And Peterson said, look, I'm not going to stand up and talk unless I'm going to stick to it. So look, I've decided to talk. And that means, as far as I'm concerned, I've already looked to the hell's version of what happens if I do this. And I've already decided that if the hell happens, I'm going to do that. So no matter what you do, I'm going to stick to my guns here. And I've thought through deeper than you have how bad this can go. So, don't think I haven't chosen my course of action carefully. And he acted that out. And it's a sort of a faith. And the amazing faith in the surrender of that is that you almost never get there. You maybe get there if you keep riding it to more and more victory until you draw more and more ire down upon you. But in general, in life, if you really commit like that and embrace the potential horrible loss, it'll generally increase the chance that you win, not lose. Do you have any opinion on First Amendment audits? Okay, I do know what those are. That's when these guys sort of go around provoking the police, not in a way that violates the law, but verbally sort of saying things and recording the police. And then if the police do anything about it, which is illegal, then he sues them, he publishes the videos, he tries to enforce that the law enforcement also follow the law, including the First Amendment. Do I have an opinion on it? What is my opinion on it? I mean, it's the kind of thing we do want in society. In a society, we want there to be police, we want there to be enforcement mechanisms of some kind, at least in a society like ours where people hurt each other without police. And then we want those police to be efficacious, but then we don't want them to be tyrants. So we want them to be curtailed in some way, regulated. First Amendment is a pretty cool idea for how to make sure that the whole country stayed pretty free. The Constitution is only sort of in effect these days. It's basically a narrative tool at this point. I mean, if something's unconstitutional, that can give your opponents an extra argument to use against you. Sometimes the Constitution's a coordinating tool to say precisely where something would become a coup, for example. Say exactly what is supposed to happen, and if somebody is not doing that, then they have openly violated the bright line. And if we all know what that bright line is, then we can potentially use that to coordinate. So I don't really get what happened with Trump and the last election. I imagine he's a sufficiently ruthless man to have tried a lot of things to win that election. But I don't know much about what happened or might have happened. But it is perhaps to some credit to the American system that it's robust against certain kinds of political plays. Like you could imagine, because when Hitler ascended, he was appointed chancellor by the president, and then he went from that position to total dictator. So he maneuvered from point A to point B. And it's like, and then he got the whole legislature to give him complete power and to sign off on everything. And he might have forced some of them at the point of a gun. And then it was technically the law and it counted, even though it was obviously fake because it was the point of a gun. But then it worked and the power structure held. But it's like maybe he just couldn't have done that in America. Maybe the enforcement mechanisms, the balance of powers, the separation of powers, and the checks and balances are just too strong. And they're still decently strong, perhaps. And if you ultimately say, wait a second, why can't a top general just take over the capital anytime? Like, and it's like, well, would the soldiers obey? It's like, well, are they loyal to the general? Are they loyal to the president? It's like, okay, well, then why can't the president take over and become a dictator whenever they want? Because they have the loyalty of the army. And it's like, well, they only sort of have the loyalty of the army, and the army knows certain rules the president's supposed to follow, and the judges could say, what if the judges are on the president's side? And it's like, well, the judges could say that it's okay what the president is doing. That's somehow constitutional. If that's corrupt enough, then the story won't be very plausible. And then people will know that this is what's happening. And the question is just, will they choose to coordinate to stop it or not? And will the soldiers, and once that becomes the narrative, and everybody knows that's the narrative, will the soldiers keep buying what the president's narrative is, or will they buy the narrative that's come from everybody else who's just like, look, here's a very clear argument for why this is unconstitutional. So why is he lying? Right? Is the president agreeing what he's doing is unconstitutional? Or is he saying it is it is constitutional, at which point, look, he's lying. So anyway, these are the sorts of structures in place that help the American system of government keep running, theoretically, even if powerful people try to break it, if that happens. And we can wonder to what degree the system is only working illusorily or not. But frankly, in this space, it's actually kind of comforting that Trump won. Like, unless it's a really weird conspiracy, like the powers that be totally didn't want Trump to win, right? Right? I mean, I know he had allies and powerful allies and all, but like, if you could rig an election, I mean, like, is the election even real? And it's like, oh, if the election was fake, it would presumably be in control of people who surely were an establishment system that worked with establishment people, and of course would have preferred an establishment candidate over Trump. So surely they didn't want Trump to win. And yet he did, and he was allowed to win and to go and to be in office. And he did being a president. It all happened. And it's like, okay, so maybe the system's real at that level. That's kind of comforting. So and this is part of the Second Amendment, I do wonder, yeah. He's saying he's so removed from politics that he's unfazed by who the president is. And yeah, it's like I don't track it too much. And I do wonder if we've overemphasized this theory of change that's like, if we just elect the right political leaders, they'll tell us to coordinate to solve our problems. And it hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked, and it hasn't worked. And it's like, okay, are we sure we're ever going to elect a president who will tell us to coordinate to solve our problems? It might not ever happen. Like Obama broke our faith, you know? Like Obama was supposed to be really different. And then it just really was more of the same. And then it was supposed to be Hillary Clinton, and it was like, obviously that would be even more of the same. And we finally had hope under Obama. And then it was really dashed to pieces. And to swallow giving up on that and just returning to never mind, obviously it's never going to change. I guess we're voting for Hillary Clinton now. And that's part of the reason, they went for Trump instead. So, right, yeah. I think maybe it's not about electing the right leaders to pass laws or to organize initiatives to provide and government funding, government coordinating, and government attention direction, right? The real power of the president is that they can just talk and so many people will listen to them, especially if they're saying anything that's actually important. And like that means you can just point millions of people at any given moment. The president can just be like, millions of people, guess what? And like it'll happen. Like that's the real power of the president, not unless there's a 2/3 majority, the veto is the president's power, and the president is technically the head of the army, who is run by the generals, and we used to declare war. I guess we don't do that anymore. Yeah, the president has a powerful coordinating power, and to some degree we can see that because Trump has kept using that power even outside of the presidency. It's why it's like we talk more about Trump even during the Biden years. It's like he's still the one directing attention. Because, yes, that's the power the president more or less automatically gets, but it's not like you actually have to be the president to use it. And frankly, most presidents who have it don't use it. Not really, not to achieve any new computation, because they're not genuinely dialoguing with you, they're monologuing at you. Trump genuinely dialogued with his audience, and he felt into how to relate to them. And that meant many of the individual moves looked insane or stupid and certainly broke the rules. And he had to be willing to break the rules in order to play an intuitive strategy, because the intuition says do this rule breaking thing. And if you're constantly inhibiting, then you can't improvise speeches for hours and hours every day for months and years like Trump did, and like basically no other president could do since who knows how long back when. So the point is, he used it for that purpose. He's still using it for that purpose, even without the presidency. And a proper president should use that tool. It would be even more powerful than their official powers as president. And they could coordinate us, even without laws, even without funding. They could just say, for example, like very small case in point. If you just wanted, for example, there to be a wonderful sort of Craigslist type market for everybody to use. But one, you would want everybody really to be able to use it, instead of just like, like, does my grandma know about Craigslist? Probably not. Lots of people don't know. Lots of people don't use it. And second, it sucks. It's like 20, 30 years old or whatever. It's completely sucks. And it's like, how is it this bad? And it's such a big tool still, and not nearly as big as it could be. Why don't they improve it? They never improve it. And it's like, we can't make a good one and a new one. We can't make a good and a new one, like maybe an open source one, because only a few people would use it at a time, and that meant there wouldn't be very many connections. And so it wouldn't ever replace Craigslist as the go-to place to find real connections. Because that's what Craigslist has. It has network effects. It's this ability to sort of simulate matchmakers without matchmakers by having instead lots of computation instantiated in the group through signals passed back and forth. Fine. So the president can just say, "Hey, make an open source version of one that is known to be good and safe and ethical, one that is a million times better than this terrible format, and I'll like announce it." and tell people to go to it, which means like 1 million people will reliably go there. And if you know 1 million people are going to go there, there's a lot of things that I wouldn't go to. But if 1 million people were going to go to them, then I'd go check them out. And so if you know 1 million people are going to check it out, 10 million people are going to check it out. And if 10 million people check it out, then like 100 million are going to check it out. And it doesn't even have to just be a national initiative. The president's ability to speak transcends borders. The president, if they said they wanted to talk to the people of the world, the citizens of any particular country they addressed, a good chunk of those citizens would listen. And so you could establish a sort of Craigslist, like just so trivially, just a few programmers that make something better than the horrible version there is now. You've already got the network effects at the drop of a hat, anytime you want them, as the president. And this is the real power that the president never employs, and that Trump kind of employs, but not to the best end. His talents, his efficacy has not translated into, exactly change either. It's like, I think if because Biden does seem like a weak candidate, especially this time around, Trump might trounce him in the debates. But one vulnerability that Trump has now and had last time, so I guess we've already seen how this plays out, is what's so good about what you're going to do, Trump? When you weren't the president and you'd never done it before, you were all like, I'm going to have the greatest people and we're just going to make everything awesome. You want to know how awesome? You're going to be winning all the time. You want to know how much you're going to be winning? You're going to win so much, you're going to be sick of winning and wish you didn't have to keep winning. And then you're just going to keep winning even more. And it's like, okay, so that didn't happen. So disappointing, Obama was disappointing in that sense. Trump was disappointing, certainly relative to the game he talked. And yeah, some people are fighting to get him back in because Biden seems more establishment. And it's like Trump could be more like change. And it's like, more like change relative to nothing, maybe. But like, what? But like, doesn't exactly look like he's going to get it all fixed for us, So the point is, yeah, maybe it's not as much about who the president is. It's crazy how close the elections are. I've heard a great analysis of this, which says that these sorts of systems systematically recalibrate over and over and constantly to the 50-50 point, because if a party starts to get ahead, like a 60-40 split, let's suppose, then the extremists in that party will start to hammer their leaders harder and harder. And those leaders will have to capitulate to some degree or be replaced by more extreme party members who will. And then as the new leaders start to adopt more extreme positions, they alienate certain amounts of the voter base and they drift away from their 60-40 lead back towards 50-50. And, this is going on all the time. And if they go too far, then, they lose a bunch of seats. And then the extremists shut up because they keep making everybody lose all the seats. And so then the party is allowed to take a more moderate position that appeals to people. And so that's why the parties have also remained at the 50-50 split, even as the actual issues have wildly changed over time. It's like, no, it's always led between the interplay between holding on to enough of the base to win and appeasing enough of the extreme base not to be replaced by more ideologically extreme candidates. So maybe that's part of why this happens. And maybe we should give up on that theory of change. We should give up on hoping the president will be the right president and then everything will be okay. We should say, okay, if it's not happening that way, and if it's not happening from the politicians, then now we have to figure it out ourselves. And we don't know how to do that, which is probably why we keep hoping the politicians will. But we have to give up on that dream and accept the alternative, which is that we need to do it and we don't know how to. And so I guess that's the next step. And I don't know what to say with regards to pushing culture here because Peterson and others like him are doing what I suspect happens every time an empire is in decline. Every time an empire starts to decline, the wise people stand up and say, hey, the new things we've been doing are leading to this decline. Therefore, we need to return to the traditions that worked before. And every time the empire has continued declining and then collapsed. And no empire has avoided eventual collapse. And every collapse has had these sorts of let's go back to what works, and then every empire collapses. So it seems so right and in some sense tempting to say, okay, to make things work, we'll just go back to the things that we know work, or go back to traditional values in some sense. But if we know that empires reliably decline in the presence of these sorts of efforts, then maybe we need to reject that obvious, intuitive, tempting plan that seems so clearly the right and the wise way to fix these problematic mutations in the culture. But I suspect to actually navigate a declining empire, you have to find a way to embrace the trajectory shift and somehow turn the decline, the loss, into gains of new kinds, and to embrace in good faith the new ideas being put forth, even when they have shown themselves to be harmful sometimes. You look for the version of them that would be positive. So, whatever you think is new and wrong and needs to be done away with in culture, you look at it and you say, what is the best version of this? What is the version of this I could have some respect for? And we try to integrate, we assume there are insights in the new ideas of the young, let's suppose. And we look for all the good in them and we allow them to reshape culture to some significant degree. And we insist on inhibiting them, on judging them, on curtailing them, and on eliminating versions of them that seem bad, even if other versions of them are okay. So, like, just because, like, don't fall for the category mistake here. Like, this entire category of behavior is okay or legal, and therefore every single version of this category is all okay. And it's like, no. In every category, you're going to have the good version of the thing and the bad version of the thing. And anything you think is all bad, we want to find the good version of it and encourage it. And the degree to which the category insists on manifesting itself somehow and doesn't care if it's the good version or the bad version, we want to meet it and handshake with it by saying, look, we didn't necessarily invite you in the first place, but if you're insisting on being here, then we encourage you. We encourage the best version of you and hope that that will take care of some of the prevalence of the worst version of you. And likewise, we look for all the things we say are best, the things that we think we should go back to. And, we're open to seeing the bad in them. We have to accept, I mean, a lot of things. Like one example that comes to mind is like what marriage is. It's like what a legal marriage is one as a legal thing already separate from like the religious tradition or whatever tradition it came from. And two, even the legal meaning changes basically in response to judge culture. Like whatever the judges tendencies are as far as assessing marriages, that's when you find out what happens when you leave a marriage is when the judge judges. So, is that the same institution? And there was this argument that the religious people made about gay marriage. They were like, well, this is the marriage thing. It's this certain thing. If you open it up to include these other shapes of things, then we're talking about a different thing at that point. And then it happened anyway. And then the religious people were like, oh, well, we're still treating it like the thing. And it's like, well, wait, I thought you just got done telling us that it isn't the thing anymore. And, put aside the straight gay part, it's more like, I don't know. I mean, the culture is very different. The multicultural thing makes a lot of sexual mores very difficult to enforce, in the sense that like when we make fun of Leonardo DiCaprio for dating younger women, that's a milder type of enforcement where we verbally lower the status of people who violate certain norms. And we're sort of still talking about monogamous relationships as these sort of sacred things. And at the same time, it's becoming more common to have something more like serial monogamy. And the question again is, wait a second, is serial monogamy the same thing as the whole lifelong partnership monogamy? And in a culture where, I don't know, like part of it is just that people have so many more options now. Like we have the wealth, the prosperity, the transportation, the technology, the free time, the beauty products, the health products, and etc. That, like back in the day, you were often like just struggling to get through the day, like with your family. And, relationships were pretty solid in that sense. You were really sort of dependent on each other in a big way. And that had a lot of disadvantages. But we built up a culture around it, a culture of what that relationship meant. And that relationship could be generally expected to be, among other things, sexually exclusive with a high success rate in some cultures. Not that many, or at least that's the story. But now, when people are capable of finding alternative sexual partners more or less anytime they want, um, like imagine living your whole life 100 years ago, and it's like during your 80 years, there were like 6 days where if lightning had struck and the wrong temptation had arrived, you would have like violated your marriage. And like, oh my goodness, but you didn't. You're good and faithful, and frankly, you're very faithful, even with the six. But in the modern day, it's like, oh yeah, every time those 6 days happened, you had an opportunity, and probably there were a lot more than six because the opportunities often came knocking. And it's like, okay, very different culture. What do we do with relationships in a different environment? Is the answer keep doing marriage exactly the same and then have serial monogamy and serial divorces? I mean, when divorces were less common, it made more sense to people, I think, that they were so awful. It was like, is it the awfulness of the legalities of the process, or is it just that divorce is awful as a thing to occur, to break up a marriage? How horrible. And it was traumatic, like genuinely traumatic for people and for children. And it was like, yeah, that's how it is, man. And it's like, doesn't it kind of ruin your life for a few years while making you think a lot of why your life is ruined has to do with the relationship instead of the legal complexities of the situation? And like the whole splitting up of property requires you to sort of like assess your entire life in a certain way. It's a extremely psychoactive thing, and you're constantly told how to interpret it. And the degree to which that's inaccurate due to the psychoactivity will like manifest as strong stress signals. And then if you're just feeding those stress signals back into the narrative, definitely being true, and this is why you have this stress. And now the very thing you do to try to relieve the stress turns out to be part of the system that maintains the stress, and people get in these loops. This is basically Joe Hudson's golden algorithm. Is like the thing you do to resolve your thing is the thing that maintains your thing. And that's definitely true sometimes. And it's especially true of tricky patterns that evade detection. So, very good insight. But, yeah, maybe we should start coordinating without waiting for a president or a regime change. And we should start coordinating before we know how to try without looking silly because we don't know what we're doing. And I was talking about metamodernism with someone the other day. And at one point they were like, okay, so what do we do? And I said some clever thing that I came up with, but like I was a little bit disappointed, and I thought back about it, and I didn't really know the answer, and people ask this sometimes. It's like, yeah, if I could recommend you do something, what would I recommend? It's like a difficult question to answer, and I'm not sure anybody has the answer. I don't know, who could you ask on the planet and be like, hey, how do we solve this? And they would have an answer. As far as I know, there exists no such answer. But in my mind, what that means is that just getting this friend of mine to ask, okay, so what do we do, was already the success. I think what we need to do is all ask that question, not answer it. We already know we can't answer it. We have let knowing we can't answer it keep us from generating failed answers. And instead of that, we need to accept that they will inevitably be failed answers and generate them anyway. We need the intuitive speech, you could say, that comes out even when we know we don't have the answer. But what we say doesn't come out as complete nonsense or randomness. It comes out as hints and clues and intimations, and then it bounces off other ideas of other people, and we run the dialectic, we put it together. And if we just fail at the right question together, that already is the metamodern success. Metamodernism isn't the answers, it's the path to the answers, the recommendation that we take the path to the answers, that we run the dialectic until we find whatever is on the other side. And then whenever we find it, we'll need a new word for whatever comes after metamodernism. But for now, metamodernism is the age of the question and not the answer. And it's the time of embracing failure and chaos because we have no choice, but we have no choice about experiencing them. Failure and chaos. We're going to lose track of truth. It's already happening. It's happening worse and worse. It's going to get worse. People are going to start lying more for political purposes, among other things. AI is going to make it impossible to do a lot of things. We know we're going to experience certain problems, and instead of resisting them, we need to embrace them and discover the new opportunities within them. So we have to embrace them before we know what we're going to do with them. Embrace chaos. Yes. Embrace that the environment is chaotic and that we must learn to navigate it without being able to map our way clearly through it. The fact that we can't map our way anymore has kept our feet cemented to the floor. And by embrace chaos, what I mean is to step into the dark because you have to step. Even if the step is going to be a failed step, you can't let that keep you from just standing there forever. That logic made sense in a previous paradigm, but we just can't stand there forever. So we keep running this loop. If I step, I'll fail. If I step, I'll fail. If I answer, it'll be wrong. If I answer, it'll be wrong. It's like, yep, now do it anyway. And I think if we think forward, or maybe we use tools like metamodern drama, literature, and other things, I think if we can appreciate this, we can look forward and notice ahead of schedule, hey, we're losing control of certain things. And if we're going to lose them inevitably, we might as well get ready for the new paradigm. Why hang on to the last minute, waiting as long as possible until we're forced to adapt? Let's look ahead, notice what we're going to lose, learn how to live in a world where we've already lost it, and then start applying those tools and insights now to give ourselves a smooth transition instead of a jerky, forced one. So metamodernism is the attempt to smooth that transition by embracing the incoming loss of shared narrative and context in the world, and try to speed run our way to a new equilibrium. I mean, maybe we should just embrace the chaos. The metamodern way would be to leap into the chaos and embrace it and embody it and show all of its beauty and even the beauty in some of its exaggerated forms, and then do the same with order and show the wonders of order, and then say, look, I didn't try to hide the beauties of chaos from you. I just wanted you to see the truth on both sides, and then trust that the tendency within you, especially when guided, will be to choose more of what is good for everyone. This is another idea for how to break the taboos of our culture. We say the taboo things, but we also say the opposites of them. And they can try to get us for saying the taboos, but given that we've already said the opposites as well, it won't hit the same way. And I have a plan to use a four corners opposite. So not just two opposites, but four corners, and it's like three different types of opposites relative to the first. And if the first is a taboo, and you say the three kinds of opposites and the taboo, then again, it's like this. It's like showing all the beauty of chaos and all the beauty of order and saying, I said both. I know I wasn't supposed to say some of those, but I said both and all of them. I said the ones I wasn't supposed to say, but I also said the ones I was supposed to say. That helps it some. And I said new ones that were worth saying, that I could only say because I was willing to look in the darkness and the shadow. Yeah. So I've wondered about this. I've wondered, like, how do we manage that? And it's like, maybe, I don't know, because the postmodern answer is destroy them, get rid of them, don't even debate them. Don't even debate them. And I'm a little bit like, don't platform them. That's the idea. You think you're defeating them by arguing against them, but whether you win the argument or not, you've platformed them, and that's already the loss. And I wonder if there's some way to just say, look, instead of Part of the idea, part of the theory is you turn something up to 11 to reveal what's missing in it. So you could take such a theory that people didn't like, and you could say, instead of saying everything wrong about it, we could turn it up and say, you're not going far enough. Make that theory even more extreme and more extreme and more extreme, and use it to explain everything. And let's see the whole of reality through the lens of that theory. Let's make it our God. Let's talk about sacrificing everything else to it and worshiping it in that sense. And if you do that with something, its errors often become obvious. It's silly for most things to even pretend to be God in that sense for a moment. And at the same time, by looking at it in that perspective, what is true about it, what is worth giving attention to about it, is brought into the spotlight. And so instead of resisting it, you integrate it, you welcome it in, you exaggerate its signal to bring out its best and its worst. So you exaggerate its signal to make it easier to discern. And I wonder if this is a better way of handling these things instead of trying to squelch them. You blow them up and then trust, right? That's the scary part. You have to trust. If we blow this theory up and fill the whole meme space with it for a 2-week news cycle, will it really explode everything forever? Or will everybody work through the ideas and the counter ideas and the counters to the counter ideas and back and forth and back and forth? And by the end of 2 weeks, it'll have settled down, and the most important things to have happened in the dialectic will have worked themselves out, and the details aren't that important, and everybody would just move on. Move on with the improved insights of having detected the problems with the theory and the good things about the theory. And depending on what those particular insights are, moving on with them integrated can mean course correcting, sometimes in a huge way. But that part of it, of course, is only what would make it seem even more worth keeping down for people who wanted to preserve things as they are. But in theory, it wouldn't be in the best interests of people in general to do that. It would be better to have those insights. Like somebody like Richard Dawkins would probably be uncomfortable with playing with ideas in a certain way because of how he's wedded to the truth. But you have to ask the question, what's more important, saying all true things all the time in every sentence, or working through a dialogue that somehow on the other side of it you ended up with a new insight? You got the truth of that insight. Most of what we say doesn't teach us anything new. If we just recite a bunch of true facts that change us in no way, it seems like we've failed at communication despite our flawless recitation of truth. So if the goal is to get new truth and new insights, then maybe the idea is magnify alternative perspectives, criticize them, appreciate them in their best and worst light, and trust in the trust in humanity to process and integrate it instead of becoming like hypnotized by it and falling down a rabbit hole, right? That's the idea. Interesting. Well, if you have an example of your best storytelling ever, I would love to watch it. Or if you are practicing and are thinking of ways to achieve this aim, I would love to brainstorm a little bit with you. I've got a friend who studied the rhythm of language for a long time, like longer than I was interested in studying it. But I so appreciated that I got to learn about it from him by peripheral interaction. So I'd love for you to become the best storyteller so that I could pick up some of your tips. All right. I'm going to head out. And but yes, what you're saying about stories here is very important. Yeah, I think Bruce Lee talks about how you need to have emotional content present in a kick. And when he does that, that means the whole body is aligned with the same intention. And when I say the whole body, I mean really the whole body, because he also yells. Like, to keep the voice from moving when you let the whole rest of the body do something, you'd have to inhibit that one part. He's not willing to do that. So he does these crazy yells, right? And he makes these crazy faces at the same time. So he doesn't keep the face or the voice still while the rest of the body moves. He moves the whole body, including the face and voice, genuinely his whole being aligned with the intention. We need emotional content, he says. And I think the way to achieve this as you go about your life is to feel the force of the momentum of the moment upon you. It's to catch into, to cultivate, and to allow yourself to be inspired by the drama of the moment, the narrative significance. I have been reflecting on this recently of like my whole life, of like my life's trajectory and how I've come here. And in some I've had this interesting experience. Like if I'm doing a stretch and I sort of remember to reflect on how my whole life has gone and somehow it's come into this exact moment right here. And I feel the sort of meaning of that moment in a different way. And I feel it's easier to do this emotional content pairing with the physicality that isn't just for the emotion's sake, it's for the physical, it's for the sake of excellent fighting. It's for harmonizing the organism. The body moves more effectively like this. So I think we've missed the narrative layer of reality and we've postmodern nitpicked it to pieces. And so people have lost that sort of touch and they've lost the shared ground that it generated. So anyway, I'm heading out and good to see you. I'll see you next time.